by Gentry D. French, demanded I move my boat, unaware I owned the lake, and evicted their fishing club. That was the headline screaming in my head the moment I found that bright orange notice taped to my windshield. I had just stepped off my old but reliable aluminum rowboat, which I had moored on the same little dock my grandfather built decades ago, when I spotted the paper flapping beneath my wiper blade. It was a breezy morning. The sun had barely risen, and I was the only person out there enjoying the tranquil lake view. Except, apparently, for whoever had quietly marched onto my property to leave this so-called violation notice. I recall staring at the neon paper and thinking, this must be some mistake, right? But when I saw the words Homeowners Association, my suspicion flared. There was only one HOA around here, Maplewood Shores, and I'd heard rumors that they had become tyrannical under a woman named Karen Lockwood. Still, I had no idea how far they had gone or what kind of showdown was about to unfold. I glanced back at my boat and the shimmering water beyond it. I had no clue that this tiny slip of paper would mark the start of a battle involving property rights, hidden corruption, and an attempt to bully me off a lake I'd owned since I inherited it from my late father. I pulled the notice free, read it through in one pass, and then reread every line twice. In bold print, it listed alleged infractions: unauthorized vessels, improper mooring, violation of community aesthetic guidelines. The text demanded that I move my boat within 72 hours or face escalating fines. The number, $500, 0 cents a day, was outrageous. My immediate reaction was outright confusion. I'd lived here for 6 months, but the land and lake had been in my family for generations. The letter gave me instructions to register my watercraft with the Maplewood Shores HOA office or risk having it towed away. Towed? How does one even tow a boat from private property? The entire threat was so absurd it was almost comical. I couldn't help but smirk as I imagined them hooking a chain onto my grandfather's old rowboat and dragging it away through the mud. Yet beneath that momentary amusement, I felt a creeping anger stirring. Just who did they think they were? The truth of the matter was that even though my property was next to the Maplewood Shores development, my late father had never signed anything allowing that HOA to extend its jurisdiction over our lake. The boundary lines clearly showed I was outside their official territory. Somehow, they either didn't know or had decided to pretend I was part of their domain. The one name that popped into my head was Karen Lockwood. I'd heard the neighbors talk about her before. She was the newly elected president of Maplewood Shores HOA, known for her relentless pursuit of community standards. According to local chatter, she believed everything around the development had to conform to her vision of tidiness and uniformity. She wasn't just any HOA president, she was the kind that made grown men roll their eyes. I crumpled the notice in my hand, though not before snapping a picture of it with my phone, then tucked it into my jacket pocket for future reference. The wind rustled the trees by the shoreline. Sunlight danced on the lake's surface as if completely indifferent to the trouble brewing. I sat on the old dock for a minute, letting the morning's serenity calm me. My dad had always said, if you're going to get into a fight, make sure it's worth swinging for. He was a private kind of man, not much for legal disputes or public spats, but he also believed in standing your ground. This lake had been ours since my grandfather's time. Grandfather purchased it back when farmland stretched for miles in every direction. He'd built a modest log cabin, a small dock, and carved out a life here. Over the decades, my father inherited both the property and the sense of responsibility for preserving it. Now, that responsibility fell to me. No mere piece of paper would push me around. I marched back up to my cabin, the gravel crunching underfoot, and walked into the living room where boxes of old documents were still stacked. After losing my father last year, I'd taken a break from my city job and moved to the cabin to sort through everything, both physically and emotionally. The plan was to take a sabbatical, fish when I felt like it, maybe do some remote consulting, and figure out what I really wanted from life. I had only begun to scratch the surface of my father's records. On a small oak desk by the wall, I'd placed our property deeds, old surveys, and legal descriptions. There was no doubt in my mind that I owned the land up to and including the lake's bed, and a 15-foot buffer around its high water mark. If the HOA truly intended to claim authority, they'd have to square up with official county records. Though I felt secure in my ownership, I decided I needed more clarity. I had a friend named Harriet who worked as a paralegal in the next county over. She was familiar with real estate law and had helped me once before with the zoning question. I gave her a quick call, explained the gist of the situation, and asked if she'd be willing to check any relevant documentation regarding Maplewood Shores. She said she'd see what she could find, but it might take a few days. Meanwhile, Harriet advised me to document everything: pictures, videos, notes of any interactions. I thanked her, then I noticed my phone's email inbox lighting up with an incoming message. It was from an address labeled Maplewood Shores Enforcement, subject line, urgent boat removal. I raised an eyebrow. How had they gotten my email? My father's old contact info, possibly, or maybe they'd done a property records search. The tone of the email was sharper than the paper notice. It spelled out that a failure to comply would result in fines and possible legal action. I felt my fists clench slightly. The audacity was remarkable. My boat sat on a dock built on land that's been in my family for over half a century, and they were threatening to impound it? I walked outside again, scanning the perimeter to see if any Maplewood Shores security staff lurked in the bushes, but there was nobody. Just the breeze, a pair of mallard ducks gliding on the water, and the rustle of leaves overhead. My frustration momentarily gave way to a concerned thought. If they were this aggressive with me, how many other people were they harassing? I'd heard stories of HOAs imposing ridiculous rules. Height restrictions on backyard fences, disallowing certain colors of paint, fining people for having a front yard garden. But here, on my own property, they had zero jurisdiction. Or, at least, that's what I was certain of. After spending an hour reviewing old folders, I decided I needed to see what was going on in Maplewood Shores for myself. I hopped in my pickup truck, driving just a mile down the road, until I reached the polished, manufactured entrance to that fancy lakeside community. The sign read, Maplewood Shores, a premier lakefront experience. The wide boulevard was lined with identical houses, sporting well-manicured lawns. Something about it gave me the willies. It all felt too controlled, as if each mailbox were placed at an exact measurement from the curb, each lawn mowed to the precise same height. Yet I spotted no passers-by. An eerie, cookie-cutter silence hung in the air. I found the HOA office near a small playground. The building was a single-story structure that doubled as a community center, painted a soft beige and crowned with a bright white sign bearing Maplewood Shores Management and Administrative Offices. I parked, walked in, and approached a reception desk. A young woman named Melissa greeted me in a robotic yet polite tone, asking if I had an appointment. I held up the violation notice I'd received and explained I needed to speak with whoever was in charge. She studied the paper, her face perplexed. "Let me see if Ms. Lockwood is available," she said, standing up. As I waited, I scanned the walls. There were framed pictures of community gatherings, Easter egg hunts, July 4th barbecues, fishing tournaments. Among them, I recognized my lake's shoreline in a few shots. That set off alarm bells in my head. They'd been using the lake for their events all this time, but as far as I knew, they never asked my father for permission. I looked closer at one photo, a group of neatly dressed folks with rods and reels, standing on a makeshift dock that didn't look familiar. My gut told me they had built something temporary for that event, again without any contact with my family. A voice startled me. "Can I help you?" I turned around to see a woman in her late 40s, dressed in a meticulously tailored navy blazer, looking at me over the rim of her glasses. She had short, stylized blonde hair and an air of unyielding authority. This had to be Karen Lockwood. I introduced myself. "I'm Benjamin Reeves. I live on the property just west of the development." That was typically enough to clarify who I was, but she stared blankly at me. I continued, "You've sent me a violation notice, claiming my boat is on your community property." "That's inaccurate." She pursed her lips. "Ah, so you're the man occupying the old cabin," she said, occupying in the same tone someone might use to describe rats in an attic. Then her eyes flicked to the paper in my hand. "Yes, we did issue that. We have guidelines for watercraft, and your vessel does not meet the standards set by Maplewood Shores. Additionally, we do not show any active registration for it. Our rules are quite clear." My jaw tightened. "Your rules do not apply to me. My property is outside your HOA boundary. I own that land and the lake. My father paid taxes on it for decades. I'm not a member of Maplewood Shores." She smiled, though it looked more like a grimace. "This area is recognized as part of our extended community. We maintain the lake, host fishing tournaments, ensure it remains pristine. If you'd like to keep a boat on it, you must comply with our regulations." Her tone reeked of unwavering self-righteousness. I handed her a copy of my deed, which I'd brought along. "Here's the county record. My property lines encompass the lake. I have full rights to it." I tapped on the relevant section with my finger, but she didn't even look at it. "Mr. Reeves, Maplewood Shores has historical precedent in managing these waters," she said, dismissing the document. "I'm certain we can come to an arrangement. Perhaps you'd consider joining the HOA. We have membership dues and you'd gain all the benefits. Beautification projects, security patrols, community events. We welcome all lakeside residents." Not interested, I replied firmly. My pulse was ticking faster. And I suggest you stop distributing threatening notices. The lake is mine. I turned to leave, but she spoke again, voice clipped. You might want to rethink your position, Mr. Reeves. Ignoring the rules can get costly. I kept walking. Anger boiled inside me. That short exchange clarified everything. Karen Lockwood considered my property fair game for Maplewood Shores. Maybe they'd been using it for their events so long they felt entitled. Maybe the county tax records needed updating to reflect my father's passing. Whatever the reason, they were pushing an agenda. Her last words echoed in my mind. It can get costly. He's a threat, basically. On my way home, I phoned Harriet again, describing the conversation. She sounded amused, but concerned. They can't just annex your property into the HOA, she said. But some boards get aggressive, especially if they think they have local officials in their pocket. Let me dig deeper. Meanwhile, keep your boat right where it is, see if they escalate. That night, I tried to relax on my porch, gazing at the moonlit water. A sense of unease gnawed at me. My father had always been proud of owning the lake, especially because it was teeming with wildlife: bass, catfish, herons, turtles. My grandfather, an avid outdoorsman, used to say, when you respect the land, it'll respect you back. My father championed that idea, seldom letting outsiders overfish or pollute the area. Yet my father also had a soft spot. Sometimes local kids would come fish, and he never chased them off. But a big corporate-styled HOA was another matter altogether. The next morning at sunrise, I went to the dock as usual to cast a line and maybe catch some breakfast. The moment I rounded the corner, my heart pounded. My boat was missing. Not just moved, it was gone. The rope that tethered it was severed, left dangling in the water. A small plastic sign jammed into the shoreline read, HOA impound notice. I rushed over, snatched it up, and read, This unauthorized vessel has been removed per Maplewood Shores Authority. Please contact the HOA office to reclaim. I was furious. They'd gone from threatening notices to outright theft. I stormed back to my cabin, called the sheriff's department, and explained what happened. The deputy sounded sympathetic, but told me it sounded like a civil dispute. He asked if I could prove the boat was on my property, and I insisted I had deeds, photos, everything. He promised to look into it, but I sensed reluctance in his voice. For all I knew, the local sheriff's office might have a friendly relationship with Maplewood Shores. Seething, I called Harriet again. They stole my boat! I almost shouted into the phone. Harriet let out a low whistle. Okay, this is serious. Document everything. We'll file a complaint. Also, check if you can get any security footage. I remembered I had an old trail camera my dad used to monitor wildlife. I set it up by the dock. Not that it helped me now since the boat was already gone, but at least I could catch them if they came back. Then I drove over to the county clerk's office. My father's name was still on some documents, but I had the inheritance paperwork. The clerk confirmed that the property lines indeed encompassed the entire lake. Maplewood Shores never purchased any portion of it. On the way out, I bumped into an older gentleman rummaging through a filing cabinet. He glanced at the deed in my hand and said, "Ah, you must be from Reeves' place, right? Heard there's been a fuss over that lake." I asked how he knew. He introduced himself as Gerald Stanley, a longtime resident of the county. He said there was scuttlebutt that Maplewood Shores intended to build a bigger marina to raise property values, but they couldn't do so unless they controlled more of the shoreline. It clicked. They wanted to muscle me into compliance or push me out so they could expand. Armed with this new piece of information, I left the clerk's office determined to escalate. I filed a formal police report accusing Maplewood Shores of stealing my boat. I got a copy of the complaint, though I wasn't sure if law enforcement would do anything right away. Once home, I drafted a cease and desist letter, which Harriet polished up with some legal jargon, and emailed it directly to Karen Lockwood. I demanded the immediate return of my boat. I also stated that further trespassing would result in lawsuits for damages. Less than an hour later, my phone rang. It was Karen, her tone clipped and icy. "Mr. Reeves, we have your boat secured at our maintenance facility. We can't release it until you pay the impound fees and register it properly. Our board's next meeting is tomorrow at 7 p.m. I suggest you attend." "I'm not paying anything," I retorted, voice taut, "and I'd like to see you try justifying this theft in front of a judge." She calmly said, "Our bylaws provide for the removal of unauthorized watercraft. We've acted according to standard procedure. Attend the meeting, or we can continue down a more adversarial path. It's your choice." Then she hung up. I paced around the living room, a mixture of frustration and grim resolve building. If they wanted me to walk into their lair, Maybe that was the best chance to confront them openly, gather intel, and set the record straight. Harriet suggested she come along to observe. We'll see what they say, and if they start spouting nonsense, we'll gather evidence for a lawsuit. That sounded like a plan. The following evening, Harriet and I drove back to the Maplewood Shores Community Center. We stepped in, a small crowd was there for the HOA board session, mostly older residents who likely wanted updates on landscaping, budgets, or pool rules. Karen Lockwood sat at a table with 3 other board members, all wearing name badges. She greeted the room with a forced smile, then singled me out. Mr. Reeves is here to discuss a matter of non-compliance. Non-compliance, I mused. I'd never signed anything. Harriet whispered for me to stay calm. Karen started reciting a list of infractions I'd allegedly committed. An unregistered boat, violation of community aesthetic guidelines, ignoring official notices. I cut in. I do not live in Maplewood Shores. My property is separate. And that lake you're claiming? I have the deed right here. I held up the documents. You have no right to seize my boat. An older gentleman in the audience raised his hand. Wait, that lake is part of the HOA, isn't it? Karen nodded with conviction. We've maintained it for years. I shot back. Maintaining it doesn't grant ownership. Did you inform residents that Maplewood Shores never legally purchased that lake? Have you been charging them fees for access you don't own? A low murmur spread through the room. One board member, a woman with thick glasses, leaned over to Karen and whispered something. Another board member cleared his throat, trying to diffuse tension. But Karen pressed on. Mr. Reeves, your father allowed our community to use the lake for years without issue. Now you come along, refusing to follow standard procedure. We had to remove your vessel to protect our liability interests and maintain a uniform look. I let out a mirthless chuckle. Harriet tapped my shoulder, signaling me to remain composed. My father never relinquished ownership, I said carefully. He was a kind man who let folks fish, but that generosity isn't the same as giving away the lake. The boundary lines have always shown it's private property. Someone in the audience asked what the HOA planned to do about the boat now. Karen responded, we'll be happy to release it if Mr. Reeves pays the impound fee and registers with our system so we can ensure safety compliance. Harriet finally spoke up, introducing herself as my legal advisor. Maplewood Shores is at significant risk by continuing to hold that boat. You have no legitimate claim. Mr. Reeves is fully prepared to proceed legally if this isn't resolved immediately. Karen looked rattled but tried to maintain her composure. We need time to review his documents. Meanwhile, the boat stays where it is. Several residents grew uneasy. They muttered about how the HOA might have overstepped or how they'd been paying for lake maintenance. One older woman murmured, Are our HOA dues being spent on a lake we don't even own? Another man said, This is insane. I didn't sign up for lawsuits. Karen banged her gavel to restore order. We'll schedule a private meeting with Mr. Reeves to discuss next steps. Meeting adjourned. Then she hastily stood and made her way to an office door, ignoring any further questions. Harriet and I lingered in the hall, fielding curious inquiries from residents. A middle-aged couple told us they'd been paying an extra fee labeled lake access maintenance. They expressed outrage. Another gentleman said he'd heard rumors about the HOA wanting to build a new marina to attract wealthier buyers. Harriet jotted down contact info, sensing a potential class action angle if Maplewood Shores was charging people under false pretenses. So we eventually left, tension swirling around us. Once outside, we noticed Karen smoking a cigarette near her car, no longer wearing her professional smile. She locked eyes with us, flicked the cigarette to the ground, then got in her sedan without a word. Harriet exhaled. This is bigger than we thought. They've probably been misrepresenting that lake to the whole community. I nodded. Feels like a racket. My father never said yes to any marina or anything else, but Karen's so set on controlling everything, she's willing to cross legal boundaries. The next morning, I woke up to an email from Harriet containing scanned county plans from 5 years ago. Maplewood Shores had apparently proposed an expansion at one time, construction of a private clubhouse on a portion of the lake's shore. That plan was never approved because the developer couldn't secure the land or water rights. Now it looked like the HOA was reviving that idea, with Karen at the helm. At around noon, Harriet called to say she'd talked to a local reporter, Penelope Marsh, who wrote for the county newspaper. Penelope was interested in the story of an HOA overreaching onto private land. Harriet thought shining a public spotlight might help. I hesitated. My father was a private man, and so was I, but in this scenario, it might be the best leverage to get them to back off. I told Harriet I'd think it over, then went out to the dock to see if I discovered any new damage or trespassing. Surprisingly, I found fresh footprints near the shore. They led from the water's edge up onto the grass. They were too small to be a man's footsteps, maybe Karen's or someone else from the HOA. I took photos. My trail camera had captured some movement the previous night, so I retrieved the memory card and plugged it into my laptop. The footage was grainy, but clearly showed a figure walking around with a flashlight, peering at my property. My blood boiled. This was more than a simple disagreement about a boat. They were spying. Maybe they wanted to find evidence of code violations to force me into compliance. Instead of letting my anger take over, I remembered Harriet's advice. Document, document, document. I saved the footage, appended the date stamp, then wrote an account of what I saw. The story was turning into a covert war, with the HOA sneaking around in the night. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived from Maplewood Shores. The envelope bore their official logo, and inside was a formal demand that I cease interfering with the HOA's established usage of the lake. They claimed that removing my boat was justified by implied easement and common interest community doctrine. I'd never heard such nonsense in my life. Harriet read it and laughed cynically. They're bluffing. This is full of half-truths and references to laws that don't apply. They must be trying to scare you. That same afternoon, I went to the sheriff's office in person to check the status of my theft complaint. The deputy in charge told me the matter was being reviewed. He hinted that the HOA insisted the boat was abandoned property on HOA land. I reiterated that the county deeds refuted that claim, but I noticed the deputy's face remained neutral. Perhaps Karen Lockwood's so-called connections ran deeper than I expected. Storm clouds of confrontation were gathering on multiple fronts. I wanted my boat back, but more importantly, I wanted them off my land. Harriet set up a meeting with a real estate attorney from her firm, Ms. Delgado, who specialized in boundary disputes. Delgado told me I had a strong case, but it could drag out for months or even years if Maplewood Shores decided to fight. They may hope you'll give up or settle, Delgado said, but if you stand your ground with the facts on your side, they'll crumble eventually. They're basically misrepresenting ownership. Meanwhile, Harriet's conversation with the reporter, Penelope Marsh, started to bear fruit. Penelope wanted to do an article about the suspicious behavior of Maplewood Shores, focusing on their impound of my boat. Harriet arranged a short interview at my cabin so Penelope could see the area firsthand. A day before the interview, I got an email from Karen Lockwood's official HOA address with the subject, Final Warning. She wrote that if I proceeded with defamatory statements about Maplewood Shores, the HOA would pursue legal action against me for slander. She also repeated that the boat would remain in their custody until I complied. That evening, my mind was made up. I was done playing nice. Harriet had already begun drafting a lawsuit. When Penelope Marsh arrived the next morning, I gave her the entire story, from the day I found the notice to the theft of my boat to the intimidation tactics. Penelope took pictures of the empty dock, jotted down notes, and recorded my statements. She was particularly intrigued by the mismatch between official property records and I also showed her the property line documents on my laptop, highlighting the outlines of the lake. She took photographs of those too, promising that her piece would be thorough. Karen must have gotten wind of the interview, because that afternoon, I noticed a black SUV rolling slowly down my driveway. I peered out the window. Karen stepped out, accompanied by 2 other board members, one tall, broad-shouldered man, and another woman who looked uneasy. I stepped onto my porch, crossing my arms as they approached. Karen plastered on her usual forced smile. "Mr. Reeves, we'd like to have a cordial discussion," she said. "May we come in?" Her sudden politeness was suspicious, but Harriet had advised me never to turn them away if they wanted to talk amicably. "Sure, but Harriet is on her way here, so this discussion will be on the record," I said. They nodded, and we all walked inside. Karen surveyed the cabin's interior with a critical eye. Her gaze fell upon old fishing trophies and family photos of me with Dad. The tall board member, Russell, cleared his throat. "We understand there's been some confusion about the lake. The board wants to settle this matter in a way that benefits everyone." He shot Karen a quick glance, as if trying to gauge whether he was saying the right thing. Karen took a seat, leaning forward with an air of contrived sincerity. "Benjamin, we recognize you have certain documents, but Maplewood Shores has established a tradition of usage. Perhaps we can finalize an agreement. We'll waive any fees, release your boat, and in return you'll grant us official permission to host events. You'll be compensated, of course." I nearly scoffed at the suggestion. "You want me to let you keep using my lake as if it's part of your community, but now with some hush money, and everything's fine, no harm done?" She blinked, then forced a half smile. "Well, we wouldn't call it hush money. It's more like a license agreement, a partnership. You could profit from it. The HOA members enjoy fishing tournaments, the new marina project is in early stages, and we'd like to have you on board. My pulse thumped heavily. So you admit there's a marina project? Russell chimed in, glancing nervously at Karen. It's just preliminary plans, nothing official yet. We believe it would boost property values for everyone in the area, including you. I leaned back in my chair. What about my boat? The one you stole? When do I get that back? Karen twisted her hands. Immediately. Once we have your commitment in writing, we're prepared to give you a substantial sum, plus you'd be recognized as a community partner, possibly a seat on the board. At that moment, Harriet knocked on my door. I let her in, she introduced herself, Karen exchanged a tense greeting, but Russell just looked at the floor. Harriet sat down, looked Karen in the eye, and calmly said, So, you're offering my client money in exchange for ignoring a prior theft and relinquishing some control of his privately owned lake. Is that correct? Karen bristled. No theft, ma'am. We legally impounded the boat under our bylaws. Harriet smirked. Your bylaws do not extend beyond your actual HOA boundaries. We can produce county maps to prove it. If we go to court, you'll be forced to pay damages. Now, if you want a licensing agreement, I suggest you approach it legally and not through intimidation. I sensed Karen's frustration simmering. She tried to remain poised. Look, we just want a peaceful resolution. A public dispute helps no one. I let out a slow breath. A peaceful resolution would mean you return my boat unconditionally and acknowledge I own the lake. Then, maybe, I'd consider letting you host small events once in a while for a fair fee, but as it stands, I can't trust you. Karen's forced smile vanished. Then I suppose we're at an impasse. She stood up abruptly, nodding to her colleagues. We tried. Don't say we didn't. They left, letting the door slam behind them. Harriet exhaled. That was a subtle bribe. They're desperate, probably worried about negative press or a lawsuit. Soon after, they drove away. I got a text message from an unknown number. You're making a mistake. We can make your life miserable. It was obviously from someone connected to the HOA. Harriet told me to screenshot it and save it as potential evidence of harassment. Days passed, and the tension ratcheted up. Penelope's article appeared in the local newspaper under the headline, Homeowners Association Overreach, One Man's Fight for His Lake. It laid out all the details, including quotes from Harriet, from neighbors who were upset about hidden fees, and from me regarding the stolen boat. Karen Lockwood refused to comment, so the piece made her look evasive. Public opinion seemed to side with me, a landowner defending inherited property against a meddling HOA. One night, a resident from Maplewood Shores named Darlene knocked on my door. She was a retired teacher who'd purchased a home in the HOA community a few years back. She looked flustered. I heard you were being targeted, and I just wanted you to know that Karen Lockwood has been pressuring me and others to sign affidavits claiming the lake belongs to the HOA. We refused. It's dishonest. But she keeps threatening fines for tiny infractions, like having a lawn gnome or a mailbox that's off-mandated. People are scared. I thanked her for sharing and realized Karen's grip on the residents was akin to blackmail. Comply with the narrative or face nitpicky fines. Harriet jotted down Darlene's story for the case, and Darlene left, apologizing for intruding but relieved to have an ally. The following morning, Harriet brought news. The local news channel wanted to film a segment about the controversy. I was initially hesitant. My father always avoided the limelight, but Harriet reasoned that public pressure might force the HOA to release my boat and back down. I agreed. She arranged for me to show the reporter around the property, highlight the boundary lines, and demonstrate that Maplewood Shores had no valid claim. On the day of filming, I led the reporter and a cameraman along the shore, pointing out fresh footprints indicating people coming onto my land. Then, halfway through, we saw something that made my stomach churn. Wooden stakes with red flags in the ground near the water's edge, about 100 feet from my dock. A laminated sign read, Site Survey Proposed Marina Construction, Maplewood Shores. I stared at it incredulously, the reporter's eyes widening as well. They were already marking out potential build sites. The reporter filmed me as I shook my head in disbelief. They're either supremely arrogant, or they've convinced themselves the lake is theirs, I said. The cameraman captured every detail, from the sign to the stakes and the muddy footprints around them. Karen had escalated from rhetoric to preliminary construction steps. That afternoon, I returned home to find an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a single typed page, "We'll bring you down if it's the last thing we do." No signature, no logo, but the threat was clear. Harriet, now deeply concerned, recommended I call the sheriff's department again and file harassment claim. I drove into town, but the deputy once more responded with caution. We have no proof who delivered that message. Could have been a prank. I left in frustration, feeling the system was either indifferent or under Maplewood Shore's influence. Finally, Harriet filed a formal lawsuit against the HOA on my behalf, citing trespassing, theft of property, and defamation. We requested immediate injunctive relief, demanding the boat's return. A court date was set for 2 weeks later. Meanwhile, Maplewood Shores filed a motion to dismiss, claiming their rights were established by years of recognized stewardship. The local news segment aired a week before the hearing, and the public outcry grew louder. Maplewood Shores started receiving negative phone calls and emails from across the region. Residents turned up at HOA meetings demanding transparency. Karen canceled 2 scheduled open forums, citing safety concerns. On the morning of the hearing, Harriet and I walked into the county courthouse armed with documents, deeds, maps, photos, old property tax receipts. Karen Lockwood was there with Maplewood Shores counsel, a slick attorney who tried to portray me as a troublemaker who was withholding a crucial community resource. Their argument seemed flimsy. They had no official deed or legal contract that gave them ownership. The judge looked unimpressed as they rattled off claims about implicit easement and community reliance. Then Harriet presented our side, the unbroken chain of title from my grandfather, the local tax records for the lake, my father's statements in older affidavits. She also showed the judge the impound notice, the threatening letter, and the stakes for the so-called marina. The judge's eyebrows arched. So, the HOA admits they removed his boat from land they do not own? Harriet asked. The opposing attorney tried to spin it as a reasonable measure, but the judge wasn't buying it. Within half an hour, the judge issued a preliminary ruling in our favor. Maplewood Shores was ordered to return my boat within 48 hours and cease any further action regarding the lake until ownership was fully resolved in court. Karen's face was a silent mask of rage as the judge banged the gavel. Our hearing for damages and trespassing would continue at a later date, but for now the injunction was crystal clear. They had to back off. Outside the courthouse, several local news cameras captured Karen storming off without comment. Harriet and I gave brief statements expressing relief that the court recognized basic property rights. Then we drove back to the cabin. My phone buzzed incessantly with texts from neighbors and acquaintances saying, "Congratulations," or "I can't believe it took this much to prove you own your own land." Less than a day after that ruling, a pickup truck from Maplewood Shores pulled up, hauling my boat. 2 grim-faced men unloaded it onto my property without a word. I took pictures, triple-checking for damage. It was mostly fine, though the interior smelled like bleach, as if they'd tried to scrub it. That same afternoon, the wooden stakes for the proposed marina vanished. Evidently, they were cutting their losses. But the fight wasn't over. Harriet and Ms. Delgado prepared for the next round, which would decide if the HOA owed me damages and legal fees, and whether they could still push for a partial easement to use the lake. We had no intention of granting them an easement unless it was on terms that protected me from their nonsense. Meanwhile, Penelope Marsh wrote a follow-up article titled, "Court Backs Local Landowner in HOA Power Grab." Public sentiment was strongly in my favor now. Karen Lockwood faced internal backlash. Many Maplewood Shores residents were outraged that their dues had gone toward funding an unwinnable legal battle. Some demanded Karen's resignation from the board. A week later, I received a call from a man named James Hightower, who introduced himself as a Maplewood Shores resident concerned about corruption in the HOA. He claimed Karen had financial ties to a construction company that stood to profit from the marina project. That same company donated to a local official's campaign. It painted a picture of a sweetheart deal: build a fancy marina, drive up home values, and take a percentage of profits. My boat, and by extension my property, was simply an obstacle they sought to remove. Harriet asked Hightower if he was willing to sign an affidavit, and he said yes. Armed with that potential evidence, Harriet filed a discovery motion to obtain Maplewood Shores' financial records. If it turned out they were funneling community funds into a private scheme, it would be a bombshell. The board quickly lawyered up further, but the judge allowed partial discovery, meaning some financial disclosures had to be made. That placed Karen in a precarious position. At the next HOA board meeting, which Harriet and I attended just to observe, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Residents demanded to know how much money had been spent on the legal fight against me. They also demanded to see the so-called maintenance records for the lake. Karen tried to maintain control of the microphone, but the room erupted with questions. Under pressure, Karen announced she was resigning for personal reasons. She left in a huff, while the residents looked stunned. Russell, who was also present, tried to continue the meeting but was drowned out by angry voices. After the meeting, a cluster of residents approached me. One older man extended his hand and said, "I'm sorry for all the trouble. This place used to be calm until Karen took over." Another woman added, We had no idea she was messing with private land, we just believed her claims. I nodded, thankful they finally saw the truth. Harriet suggested the residents form a new interim board until they figured things out. She also hinted that they might want to negotiate a voluntary arrangement with me if they still hoped to use the lake for occasional gatherings, but only if I agreed. The final showdown took place in the next hearing, focusing on my claim for trespassing and damages. Though Karen had stepped down, the HOA's attorneys showed up to defend the organization. Harriet presented the judge with evidence of property damage, the severed rope, the forced removal of my boat, the stake placements, and emotional distress from harassment. Maplewood Shores Council tried to argue they were acting in good faith, referencing old pictures of community members using the lake. The judge, however, was not sympathetic. He pointed out that acting in good faith doesn't excuse ignoring deeded ownership. Ultimately, the court awarded me compensation for legal fees and minor damages. The HOA had to issue a formal apology. If they wanted access to the lake, they'd have to draft a clear, mutually agreed contract stating when and how they could hold events, under what fees, and with insurance coverage for any incidents. It was a complete victory. Back home, I towed my boat to the dock, reattached the rope, and gazed across the water, letting out a satisfied breath. My father would have been proud that I stood my ground. Meanwhile, Harriet informed me that a criminal investigation might open against Karen if the financial records proved any embezzlement or corruption. That was out of my hands, though. My priority was ensuring no one tried to bully me off my property again. In the aftermath, Maplewood Shores residents held a vote to revise their HOA leadership. A more moderate group took charge, promising transparency and an end to the intimidation tactics. They reached out to me, expressing hope that we could start anew, maybe let families fish once in a while under fair terms. I agreed in principle, as long as we put everything in writing and no one tried to forcibly claim my property again. A few weeks later, I discovered a wooden bench near the southwestern edge of the lake, engraved with my father's name. Apparently, some of the residents who remembered him from long ago had placed it there as a gesture of goodwill. At first, I was wary about someone installing a bench on my land without mentioning it, but I saw it as a peaceful offering. I asked Harriet to double-check if we needed a formal agreement, but she merely smiled. "Maybe it's time to build bridges, not walls," she said. I found that ironically fitting, given how Maplewood Shores had tried to do the opposite. As for Karen Lockwood, rumors swirled that she might leave the county or face potential charges if the allegations of financial misconduct held water. A mutual acquaintance mentioned she'd put her house up for sale. I only saw her once more, from a distance, driving out of Maplewood Shores in that black SUV. She didn't look my way. I felt a pang of relief, as if a storm cloud had drifted off for good. Through it all, I learned a profound lesson about the importance of standing up for what is right, even when you're up against a seemingly unstoppable force. HOAs can be beneficial when they maintain roads and keep neighborhoods nice, but when power-hungry individuals like Karen Lockwood twist those rules for personal gain, it becomes a nightmare. I also discovered I wasn't alone. Many residents disliked the extreme tactics but were afraid to speak up. Once they felt safe, they voiced their support. In the end, I got my boat back, I kept my lake, and I formed a cautious but friendly relationship with my neighbors. We drafted a simple, straightforward agreement that if Maplewood Shores ever wanted to hold a community fishing event, they'd request permission at least a month in advance, pay a usage fee that funded shoreline cleanups, and ensure they abided by environmental protections. Harriet and Ms. Delgado drew up a tight legal framework so we wouldn't repeat the fiasco. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, I row out to the center of the lake and let the gentle waves cradle my boat. I think about my father and my grandfather, about how proud they'd be that I defended our family's legacy. The loon calls echo across the water. Fish jump. The scent of pine drifts from the shoreline. Those are the reasons we kept this land in the first place. Its natural beauty and the sense of peace it offers. And no meddling Karen with delusions of grandeur can take that away from me. A month after the lawsuit ended, Harriet and I were sitting on that newly placed bench, talking about how crazy everything had been. She smiled, recalling Karen's stunned expression when the judge ruled in our favor. Then she turned to me, expression thoughtful. "Think about it, Ben. Without that initial notice, we'd never have discovered just how deeply they were planning to exploit this lake. That's the silver lining." I nodded, letting the water's reflections dance in my eyes. Funny how adversity can reveal truths. Harriet sipped her coffee. "Any regrets?" "Only that I didn't secure everything sooner. Maybe I could have avoided the theft of my boat," I said with a small grin. "But then again, that's what brought everything into the open." Karen forced my hand. Harriet laughed softly, then looked out over the rippling waves. "Sometimes bullies dig their own graves." We watched as a heron glided across the water, its wings beating in slow, graceful strokes. The tension of those last few months felt like a distant memory. 2 days later, I received an email from Ms. Delgado, congratulating me on the successful outcome. She attached some notes. Maplewood Shores was revising their charter to prevent any future leaders from claiming property beyond their actual territory. Residents were also pushing for an audit, ensuring financial transparency. The new board might even face a recall vote if more shady deals came to light. Delgado's last line read, "None of this would have happened if you hadn't stood up for your rights. Good job, Mr. Reeves." I printed that email, tucked it into a manila folder with all the other documents from this saga, and labeled it Maplewood Shores Dispute, Resolved. Then I stacked it alongside my father's old property deeds and surveys. The lake was ours to enjoy, and now we had the legal and moral high ground. I stepped onto the porch, inhaling the crisp morning air. My gaze settled on the silver expanse of water, the light dancing across the surface like tiny shards of glass. The sun emerged from behind a cloud. It felt like a new dawn in every sense. That was the day I took the boat out again. I rowed effortlessly into the center, letting the hush of nature envelop me. A single gull circled overhead, and I imagined my father's voice in the breeze, telling me to cast a line right about where he used to catch the biggest bass. I tested the waters with my fishing rod, smiled when I felt a nibble, but didn't pull yet. The tranquility was reward enough, a testament that we'd protected what was ours. Later that afternoon, Harriet visited. We grilled fish, one I'd caught that very morning, and shared it with Darlene and a couple of other Maplewood Shores residents who wanted to make amends. They apologized for not questioning Karen's authority sooner. We all laughed and swapped stories. Darlene even admitted that growing up she used to fish at a lake near her grandfather's house, so she understood how special a private lake could be. For a moment I felt relief and gratitude that everything had resolved in such a way that the community might become closer rather than driven apart by Karen's manipulations. Of course, not everyone in Maplewood Shores would warm up to me overnight, but at least we'd established a legal precedent preventing them from trying to snatch the lake again. That night, as I drifted off to sleep, I recalled the very first line of that neon orange violation notice and how it had outraged me. Now it felt like a lifetime ago. The house was peaceful. No more strange footprints outside, no more prowling in the dark. My boat was safe, moored exactly where it belonged, bobbing gently with each ripple of water. I promised myself I'd maintain the property carefully, just like my father and grandfather did, so no one would question who it belonged to again. In the following weeks, the new interim HOA board sent me a letter officially apologizing for the miscommunication and improper handling of my property. Although they tried to phrase it in diplomatic terms, Harriet considered it an admission of guilt, which could serve as further leverage should they ever revert to their old tactics. I thanked them for the apology, stressing that we all needed to respect the land and each other's rights. As the weather grew warmer, some of the Maplewood Shores residents asked if they could hold a small community fishing day, and I agreed, provided they followed my rules. Limited hours, no litter, and no building anything on my shoreline without permission. They accepted, happy to gain some form of access. On the morning of the event, a few local families showed up, politely parked near my driveway, and greeted me with friendly smiles. It was a stark contrast to the tense standoffs that had defined recent months. Kids laughed as they cast their lines. Parents thanked me for letting them enjoy the water. It reminded me that the lake was meant to be shared, but only under the rightful owner's terms. Meanwhile, Karen Lockwood's name drifted through gossip circles. Some said she fled the county, others claimed she had found another HOA to manage in a different state. A rumor suggested that if the corruption allegations held up, she might face criminal charges. But her legacy here was tarnished. Maplewood Shores residents associated her with intimidation, pointless fees, and a failed power grab. One early evening, I sat at the bench honoring my father, listening to the frogs chirping as the sky turned orange. I allowed myself to reflect on how a single spark, one brazen violation notice, ignited a chain of events that exposed wrongdoing on a much larger scale. I understood my father's gentle approach, but I recognized that in modern times, sometimes you have to get loud and push back, or bullies will walk all over you. That's how I found peace in this corner of the world, on a lake my family has cherished for generations. The calm surface reflecting both the sky above and the stubborn determination of those who protect it. No board or official could ever change that. Every morning I wake up, step onto that dock, and know that the water belongs to me, and I belong to this place. We coexist, the land and I. As I dip my feet into the water, I thank my father for instilling in me the resolve to defend our legacy. I also thank Harriet for guiding me through legal complexities. and I appreciate the residents who realized it's better to collaborate than to dominate. When the sun sets and I see the fading light dancing on the ripples, I recall all the drama and conflict, those frantic emails, the stolen boat, the threatened lawsuits, and I think it was worth it. The environment around here remains unspoiled. Greed and arrogance didn't win, and if anyone tries such a stunt again, I'll be ready with the same evidence, the same unwavering stance. This lake is my heritage, and I won't be moved by anyone's petty demands. That conclusion might seem simple, but it's the perfect closure for a story that began with a brazen HOA Karen who thought she held absolute power. She underestimated me, she misjudged the land's true ownership, and now she and her grand plans are gone, leaving behind a community that has perhaps learned a valuable lesson about boundaries, both legal and ethical. The next weekend, Harriet and Ms. Delgado visited to celebrate the final resolution. We sat on the cabin porch, sipping iced tea, listening to the hum of cicadas as twilight approached. Ms. Delgado congratulated me once more on standing my ground. She said, "Benjamin, you've shown that when property rights and genuine respect for nature come together, even the most persistent bullies can't prevail." I smiled, watching the last glimmers of sunshine fade behind the treetops. The silhouettes of pines cast across the water gave the lake a serene aura, reflecting a sense of renewed harmony. That was the moment I realized the deeper meaning behind my grandfather's words. Respect the land, and it'll respect you back. We had faced a collective test, and in the end, my family's legacy persevered, forging new alliances with neighbors who, like me, simply wanted to live quietly, fish occasionally, and ensure that an honest sense of community triumphed over greed. I never did find out how many of Karen's threats were fueled by genuine malice versus misguided ambition. Perhaps she truly believed the lake belonged under her control, or maybe she just wanted the profit from a lucrative marina project. But in any case, she couldn't bend reality to her will, no matter how many notices she posted or how many bylaws she tried to twist. The law and simple decency stood firm. And so I rest easy now, knowing the lake remains protected, open for respectful enjoyment under the rightful stewardship of my family, past, present, and future. If there's one final note I'd pass on to anyone facing a similar plight, it's that you should never back down from defending what's legitimately yours. Sometimes the biggest threats crumble the moment you shine the light of truth on them. Karen demanded I move my boat, but ironically, she ended up moving herself out of this town altogether. As for me, well, I'm not going anywhere. My boat's right where it belongs, and the waters remain calm except for the gentle ripples of fish beneath the surface. An enduring testament to perseverance and the quiet power of standing your ground.